Matt Gaetz is one of the relatively few members of Congress who has a mugshot. There it is. That picture was taken by Florida police on the night Matt Gaetz was pulled over while driving his father's BMW. He was a recent law school graduate then, and so he had the presence of mind to refuse the breathalyzer test. And for everyone else who refuses a breathalyzer test in Florida and most other states, they automatically get their license suspended for 1 year, but not if you're Matt Gaetz and you're very white and very rich, thanks to your very rich father, who was a very powerful state senator at the time. Arrested for drunk driving, refuses the breathalyzer test, gets his case dismissed, and doesn't lose his license. And now Matt Gaetz is one of Donald Trump's favorite members of the House of Representatives, and he seems to think that he can still get away with anything because what Matt Gaetz did today is the congressional equivalent of drunk driving in the hallowed hallways of the House of Representatives. Matt Gaetz is still a junior member of the House of Representatives, but he was the leader today of a group of about 24 Republican members of the House who violated House rules and pushed their way into the secure room where the House impeachment investigating committees were scheduled to take the deposition of Laura Cooper, a Defense Department official who is an expert on delivering American military aid to Ukraine. The Republican House of Representatives is now such a disorganized gang of rabble-rousers that the number 2 member of Republican House leadership, Steve Scalise, was actually one of the followers of the very junior member, Matt Gaetz. They shouted their way into the room, even though they had no right to be there because they were not members of the committees conducting the deposition. When Republicans controlled the House, Trey Gowdy politely explained that to another Republican, Darrell Issa, explained why Congressman Issa could not be allowed in that room because he was not a member of the committee. Trey Gowdy told Darrell Issa then, quote, "Those are the rules and we have to follow them, no exceptions made." Everyone knows that. Everyone in the House knows that. Matt Gaetz and his group didn't just violate the rules by barging into that room. They violated the security of the room by bringing in their cell phones, which are not allowed in that room. As a committee staffer, will explain to us tonight the danger of cell phones in that room. The intrusion managed to delay the deposition for a few hours, but it did not do what Donald Trump and Matt Gaetz hoped it would do when they reportedly discussed this stunt at the White House earlier this week. The stunt did not take the heat off Donald Trump. The stunt did not produce any helpful evidence for Donald Trump, whose day began with a tweet that Donald Trump apparently did not realize was his confession. Congressman John Ratcliffe is a member of the House Intelligence Committee and is one of the many Republicans who has a right to be in the secure room and participate in all of the closed-door depositions. Congressman Ratcliffe was on Fox and Friends this morning, and Donald Trump took what Congressman Ratcliffe said and turned it into a Trump tweet, quoting Ratcliffe saying, in effect, "No witness has provided testimony that the Ukrainians were aware that military aid was being withheld." So there's Donald Trump confessing that military aid was being withheld by Donald Trump. And of course, William Taylor did in fact testify in his opening statement yesterday, which became public, that the Ukrainians were very much aware that military aid was being withheld. And we now have additional reporting on that point tonight from the New York Times, saying that word of the aid freeze had gotten to high-level Ukrainian officials by the first week in August, according to interviews and documents obtained by the New York Times. The problem was not bureaucratic. The Ukrainians were told to address it. They were advised they should reach out to Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House chief of staff, according to the interviews and records. The Associated Press is reporting tonight that more than 2 months before President Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine, when President Trump asked the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, the president of Ukraine was already worried about that issue. The Associated Press reports that on May 7th, President Zelensky, in a meeting with a small group of his advisors, spent most of the 3-hour discussion talking about how to navigate the insistence from Trump and his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, for a probe and how to avoid becoming entangled in the American elections, according to 3 people familiar with the details of the meeting. Donald Trump's defense this morning was Ukraine didn't know that military aid was being withheld. But Ukraine did know, and Donald Trump's defense really amounted to a guilty plea, and that's the person Matt Gaetz tried to help tried to save by breaking House rules and barging into a room to try to stop what cannot be stopped, the continued collection of damning impeachment evidence against the President of the United States, evidence that virtually guarantees Donald Trump's position in history as the third president to be impeached by the House of Representatives and sent to trial in the United States Senate. Donald Trump knows the names of every one of those Republican members of the House who broke the House rules today and violated the security procedures of that room. And if he was capable of human feeling, Donald Trump would actually be grateful to them, all 24 of them. But the names he should pay much more attention to are the 173 Republican members of the House of Representatives today who did not storm the barricades for Donald Trump, did not violate the rules of the House of Representatives today in a hopeless attempt to block the collection of more damning evidence against Donald Trump. 173 didn't do it. They knew Donald Trump was watching. They knew Donald Trump was taking attendance at Matt Gaetz' version of drunk driving in the hallways of the House. And they wanted nothing to do with Donald Trump's and Matt Gaetz' stunt. As the evidence pours in against him, Donald Trump should be wondering how many Republicans in the House might eventually vote for impeachment. Every day, it becomes more likely that impeachment will have at least some Republican votes in the House of Representatives, and Donald Trump's firewall in the United States Senate that is supposed to save him from being removed from office seems to have a new crack in it every day. Today, it was Senator John Thune of South Dakota, who is Mitch McConnell's #2 in the Senate leadership. John Thune said this about what is emerging from the impeachment investigation. Quote, "The picture coming out of it, based on the reporting we've seen, is, yeah, I would say, is not a good one." As Donald Trump's desperation deepens, he chose to put the Trumpian word perfect in Mitch McConnell's mouth, which provoked Mitch McConnell to, in his polite Senate way, call Donald Trump a liar.
The president has said that you told him that his phone call with the Ukrainian president was perfect and innocent. Do you believe that the president has handled this Ukrainian situation perfectly?
We've not had any conversations on that subject.
So he was lying about that?
You have to ask him.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.